I had the opportunity to meet a gentleman by the name of Eric Parker about a month and a half ago out in Idaho, and many of you may have heard a little bit about the Bundy Ranch, the standoff down in Arizona, but not a lot of people know much about it. And Eric was one of the people that was there, and his story is pretty profound because 2 years after the event, what happened was the government decided that they wanted to prosecute him for what had happened down there, and so I think this is a story that every red-blooded American needs to hear in regards to a lot of the different things that are happening in our world today as well. Eric, you there with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for coming on today, and I just want to start out with a little bit about tell us a little bit about yourself and honestly, like, why, like, maybe even just lead right into, how you ended up going to this thing that you don't even know the people that were actually involved with the Bundy standoff and if that's what it really was. So why don't you just break right into it for us?
Right. We like to call it the Bundy Ranch stand up, right?
Stand up. I like it.
It was a stand up. So, like a lot of Americans, back in 2014, I turned on my computer one day and logged on to Facebook, and I start seeing these videos coming across my feed from Nevada, and there was a reporter down there, an independent journalist guy. His name's Pete. He ended up being one of my co-defendants later on, but at the time, he was just a YouTuber guy, but he's down there and he's filming these things that are happening down there. And what we saw was just really heavy-handed nature of the Bureau of Land Management and their agents.
Can you give maybe just a few minutes about what was happening down there, the background?
Yeah, okay. So I started to look into it after I see these videos of dogs being sicked on people being tased, assaulted, body slammed. So I start to look into it, and what I find is that the Bureau of Land Management is in a dispute with a guy named Cliven Bundy, and it has to do with cows, ranching, grazing fees. Lots of different stuff was going on over the internet, so it was kind of hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. Everybody has a hard time with that. So we decided that we wanted to go down there, and it wasn't because of the cows, right? One of these things that we were seeing and hearing was that the Bureau of Land Management had set up this First Amendment area miles away from the ranch. And
so they set up a place where you could go and have free speech.
Yes, that's where your free speech existed in the desert there in 2014, was this little pig pen area, snow fence, off the highway, probably 20 yards by 20 yards, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people coming, right?
Yeah. It's kind of weird.
So they say that's where you can protest, and then they actually started arresting people for filming and protesting outside that area. That's when my sensibilities were triggered. And
as I understand, and there's a lot more to this story, obviously, there's actually been a documentary made, correct?
Yeah, there's a couple of them out there, but yes, there is. Mark Herr from the Center for Self-Governance made a really good one.
Yeah, centerforselfgovernance.com. You can actually order it online, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suggest people do it because there's so much we'll never be able to cover.
Yeah, there's so much to it.
Dives into the actual day of what occurred that day. The actual actions that occurred that day.
And as I understand it, to make a really in-depth story short, is that Cliven Bundy had rights to the land, to the grass, to be grazing land and the water, and the government was basically trying to take that away, even though he had by contract rights to it. Is that correct? And then
more or less. So
and then it became
the only thing I would say is that he had water rights. He had the water rights, his family's got the water rights deeded through the state. And in Nevada, those water rights come with what they call the forage for grazing. So it's connected in the state, and he has these rights. They're deeded, they're on paper through the state. So that is more or less the rights he was standing on, right? And these rights predate the BLM. They predate, and Cliven played ball with them for a while, but he quickly realized, if you were to ask him, that they were driving him out of business. They were lowering the amount of cattle he could have out there on the range. They were basically taking his money and using it to drive him out of business. So he decided he would pay the state, and he would no longer pay the federal government. He tried to do that, and like you said, it's a really long, convoluted thing that I learned all about.
Right.
But the reason I went was the First Amendment.
Right.
I've got no affinity for cattle. Right. I'm an electrician. I like my steak. I like my burger, but that's about as far as it goes with me.
So there ends up being a disagreement between the government and Cliven Bundy, and then they put up this free speech area where you can go and have your free speech in a little box, right?
Well, they decided they were going to round up his cattle, right? And they went out there with, I'd say, I'm trying to think back to the discovery. It was at least 300 agents, and then as far as contract cowboys and stuff, there was another, large group of them. But they went out there and they started rounding up the cattle, and that's what brought the protest. And people started protesting. They reacted very heavy-handed to those protests, and that's kind of what started to trigger the people wanting to come and see, like myself, wanting to come and see what was going on, really.
And how did it end?
On the internet. Well, it ended with about 600-700 people in a wash asking the BLM to go home. Earlier that day, the sheriff had come over to the Bundy Ranch where the protest rally thing was happening, and he got up on stage. He said the BLM's leaving, ceasing their operation, leaving the area. About an hour later, all the cowboys and the protesters headed over to where they were, the BLM were, and as they approached, as we approached, we saw that they were not leaving, that there was a very militarized presence there. Protesters fed down into the wash. They got their hands up. They're telling the BLM to leave, like the sheriff said. BLM agents, federal agents from a couple different agencies, right? BLM, NPS, Park Service, a couple different agencies, Forest Service. All their law enforcement branch, down there, they're all pointing guns at these protesters and threatening to use violence if they don't disperse.
Whoa. You're telling me the federal government would use violence and intimidation against its own people?
For exercising constitutionally protected conduct. Yeah.
Weird. I feel like that sounds more like communist, Russia, or maybe like Nazi Germany or something like that. But I just had to bring that up because, with 4th of July coming up, that's a very important aspect to keep in mind with all the listeners to this story, is that these weren't a foreign government. These weren't a foreign power. This is your own law enforcement doing this to American citizens.
That are supposed to protect life, liberty, and
pursuit of happiness and property.
Happiness, yeah.
But anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Right.
I just had to get that out.
No, you're all right. It's 4th of July. These are, it's not lost on me that we were standing on a bridge, staring down an armed, what I would call an army, pointing guns at people exercising their constitutionally protected conduct. That's, it is very relevant. And, I think the media likes to portray that moment in time as the people rising up with guns and scaring the federal government into submission and leaving. That's not what happened, right? That the idea of us being able, we just heard Biden we just heard the president say you can't do that's not even possible,
Right.
That they have F-15s and nukes, right?
Except for the insurrection
So-
that supposedly happened with no weapons at all. How does that happen?
Yeah, they can't have it both ways, can they?
No, they cannot.
They shouldn't be able to, at least. But the idea that what I'd like to talk about and what I really like to talk about when I'm talking about this is what put an end to it. Because for a moment, when they said we've been authorized to use lethal force and they've got guns and snipers and they're on Americans in a wash with their hands up, I was afraid, right? I took a defensive position. Now the media portrayed that as me, a sniper, they like to call me, and all this nonsense. But the reality of it is, and why I'm here talking to you today after 2 federal trials, is I took a defensive position after they said they were authorized to use lethal force.
And wasn't there over 70 gunmen from the feds there? Or something like that?
Oh, yeah. No, per the FBI and the discovery in the trials, there was about 125 rifles on the other side of that fence.
And how many were on your side?
There was 20, 25.
Wow.
Yeah, you guys were the enemy at some. How does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and the narrative is that we drove them out of there, right? These 20 protesters. No, I wasn't in a militia. I'm not in a militia. I was an irritated electrician, right? And so 20 people that are irritated and saying, "Hey, don't shoot us, don't shoot them." They've got their hands up and they're exercising their constitutionally protected right. Turned into this idea of a mass force of domestic terrorists running the federal government away from doing their job, right, obstructing. And that's not what happened at all. What I'm here to say, and the reason I was acquitted is the system worked that day. The sheriff's department came in and de-escalated the situation. After 10, 15 minutes of them pointing guns and telling everybody to get out of the wash or they were going to shoot them, the sheriff's department saw what was going on and came in their loafers and their uniform and walked up and they told those federal agents, "Listen, we're going to take the front of this thing. We need you to back out." And that's in video.
Wow.
That's on the Discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And then they de-escalated the situation. The protesters at the fence, they said, "Hey, we're not going anywhere." And the sheriff said, "We're not asking you to go anywhere. You have the right to be right there doing what you're doing." Right? So once you removed this jurisdiction, once the separation of control and power was reapplied, you had peace. And you had de-escalation occur rather than what was occurring, right? And so that's what led me to the Center for Self-Governance, really, is that I witnessed the system work correctly. I watched it work incorrectly for a couple of days, for a week, and then I watched it work correctly. And so I've got an understanding of the way it's supposed to work when it works correctly. And that's the authority having jurisdiction who's trained for these situations come in and de-escalate it.
Which was the sheriff.
Which was the sheriff, right? And you're not going to catch that on the mainstream media, right?
No, you guys were crucified on the mainstream media. A lot of people. Example, like if you just Google your name, one of the first ones that always comes up is the NPR, like the Bundy Ranch sniper, which, to be honest, is kind of a cool name when you think about it. I mean, there's a lot of worse things you can call.
When I finally write a book, I'm gonna call it "Don't Call Me Sniper."
There we go.
Because well, I mean, and you look at the picture. There's not even a scope on there. I wasn't prepared to be in any kind of situation like that, right? The only reason I brought my rifle and my armor was the day I was getting ready to drive down there. I was packing my truck, and a friend of mine sent me an article, and it was the guy's name's Tom Collins. He was a Clark County administrator. He got on TV and he said anybody coming to support the Bundys better have funeral plans and a body bag.
Wow.
That's a government elected official. And then when you Google the guy, you find out he had a DUI, crashed into a tree, and then got out of his car and shot it. So he's unhinged.
Oh, of course.
He's on TV telling people that if they come and exercise their First Amendment right, that they better be, body bags and funeral plans. I'm sorry, I'm an American. I'm not going to be intimidated into not exercising my First Amendment right. I mean, that was the whole point anyways. They're messing with the First Amendment.
So that's another thing I think that, excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Another thing that I think is really important to note is that, government and these entities tend to function in the area that they believe they're always in the right no matter what. And we tend to just accept that. Right, and we tend to accept that, well, they wouldn't do something wrong if it was not legal. Right, but at the same time...
And if they did, they had to.
Right.
And that's very true.
Because this whole situation was almost, it's equated to a lot of people's minds that it could have been another Ruby Ridge or Waco. This was the...
Well, that's why I went, right?
Yeah.
Here's this one of the Bundys. I found out later it was one of the Bundy's son, one of Cliven's sons. He's doing a video. He's on a YouTube video. His face is bruised up and scarred up, cut up, and he looks like he went through a meat grinder, and he's telling this story about being assaulted on the side of the road for filming. And in the story, he says, above me were snipers, federal snipers with sniper rifles up above this arrest, right? And somebody snapped pictures of it. There's pictures of that out there, the two snipers on the hill above the arrest of Dave Bundy. This all came out in our trials, as hard as we tried to get this kind of stuff out, but it was in the discovery, certainly. They just wouldn't let us put it in front of the jury.
So you mentioned a trial. Then that happened 2 years later, right?
Yeah, so, fast forward, right? The sheriff comes down, backs them all out, the BLM leaves. By the time they leave, the picture of me in a defensive position is viral, right? It's all over the country. People are making memes. My aunt called me. I was still on the bridge, standing there watching the cows walk out, and she said I was on the cover of FoxNews.com.
Oh.
And that was when my life changed.
And today we see it as propaganda.
Yes. Well, and so as I start to watch these news channels talk about what happened, every time it's Cliven Bundy and his racist right-wing militia, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't make any sense to me. One, I'm not racist. I'm not even really right-wing. Yeah.
We're gonna have you finish up your thought, and then we're gonna go to a quick break, and then we're gonna be coming back. Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The media. We'll talk about the media.
Hi, my name's Eric Parker. I'm running for state senate here in Idaho. If you'd like to know more about my campaign, go to parkerforidaho.com. You can also follow the campaign on Telegram and on Facebook. We'll put the links in the descriptions below.